To discuss whether the terrorist attack on a New York City bike path on Tuesday is connected to the global war on terror launched back in 2001, I'm now joined by Nicolas Davies, author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq, who also just wrote the essay, How America Spreads Global Chaos. Thank you so much for joining us, Nicolas. Now, in your essay, you criticize the role of U.S. counterterrorism operations in fueling armed resistance and terrorism, and the absence of any plan to reduce the violence unleashed by the global war on terror. So does that influence the number of ISIS-inspired terrorist attacks we have seen in Western countries?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, what we've seen since September the 11th, 2001, since the U.S. Made the fateful and tragic decision to launch global military operations in response to these horrific crimes in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania, is that, in fact, these kind of military operations in all these other countries have only fueled terrorism and sparked a profusion of different groups from, starting with Al-Qaeda, but now we have ISIS, and in Africa we have Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, and so what we have now is a global asymmetric war, and it's really necessary for our side of that war, the people in America, people in Europe, to recognize that we are part of the problem. Our military operations are generating this, this kind of reaction, and this is a cycle of violence that we cannot break by using more violence. This is going to have to be de-escalated and by some very, very different approaches.
You mentioned Al-Qaeda and a couple other terrorist organizations. You also cite a UN report titled Journey to Extremism Africa, Drivers, Incentives, and the Tipping Point for Recruitment. Now, based on 500 interviews with African militants, the study found that CIA training missions in AFRICOM are actually fueling Africans to join militant groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and Boko Haram. So to you, does this UN report show evidence that U.S. policy is in fact increasing terrorism around the world? And if so, how?
Yes, absolutely it does. This report, and this is not the first significant report to draw that conclusion. But what it found, it refers in its title to a tipping point. And what it found is that the tipping point that actually decides individuals to join these armed groups in Africa is, in fact, when one of their relatives or a close friend is directly impacted by so-called counterterrorism operations, either killed or wounded or detained and jailed. But 71% of those interviewed said that, that tipping point that led them to actually join an armed group was precisely that. And that actually sounds very like what your interviewee in, I think, New Jersey just said, that if he was in the Middle East and he had friends or relatives killed by U.S. or allied forces or the forces that we're training and supporting there, that would make, I'm not sure if he said he would, but he said that drives people to join these groups, and that is very, very well documented at this point.
Now, Nicolas, what would you suggest the U.S. do to stop this from happening?
Well, I think we need to look at as I say, our so-called counterterrorism operations and realize that we, with our violence, are fueling the violence on the other side. People were surprised when an American Special Forces soldier was killed in Niger a couple of weeks ago. But we have 6,000 troops in Africa, in almost every single country on the continent, carrying out precisely these kind of operations that the UN report says are the main driver, the tipping point, leading people to join these groups. So this is clearly, now we claim that these operations are a response to terrorism. So, you know, we are responding to terrorism by doing precisely what is causing terrorism in the first place.
Nicholas, we're a little short on time here, so I'm just going to jump in. You're also very critical about what you describe as the CIA's politicized intelligence and how that allows them to use covert operations to spread violence and chaos across every continent. So how is it possible that the CIA isn't aware of the consequences of their covert operations in terms of fueling terrorism?
I think the CIA is aware of what it is doing, and you know, if some of your viewers have been watching the PBS documentary on the US war in Vietnam, they will have seen how the CIA did exactly that in Vietnam in order to undermine the reunification of the country, which was called for in the Geneva Accords in 1954. They made sure that the nationwide, North and South, free and fair election that was supposed to be held in 1956 did not happen, and they supported a highly repressive Diem regime in the South. And the whole country gradually rose up in rebellion against that regime, and the CIA gradually increased the U.S. military involvement, calling for more troops, calling for, you know, increased U.S. military operations, and until there was a full-scale war going on. And this is the way the CIA has stirred up trouble to justify the use of U.S. military force all over the world for the past 70 years. It is still doing it today. It did it in Syria, as we have seen, by bringing in jihadis and infiltrating them across the Turkish border.
Nicholas, I'm sorry, we're going to have
Syria,
it looks like we've run out of time, so we're just going to
country.
have to leave it right there. Thank you so much for your insight. That's Nicolas Davies, author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. Thank you so much.